Mimi Silbert isn't interested in you unless you're kind of like this guy here, unless you've had an average of 16 felony convictions. That's who she wants. She's not interested in you unless you've been addicted to harmful substances for 10 years or longer. About 2/3 of her applicants have been homeless for large stretches of time, functionally illiterate. She describes her ideal applicant as greedy, racist, and violent. Now, what I want you to know about Mimi is that she's worked with over 14,000 people, like I've just described, over the past 30 years, and has a 91% success rate at helping them turn their lives around forever. And you know what Delancey Street consists of? Mimi and them. That's it. There's no staff. There are no therapists. There are no guards. It's Mimi Silbert and a brilliant influence strategy. So we wondered, how does somebody like Mimi Silbert even think about her influence strategy? How does she do this? So we traveled to San Francisco. We spent time trying to study how she thinks about this and what she does. And what we found is that there's remarkable consistency across every one of these practitioners. We found that these principles don't just work in these kinds of social problem areas, they work in a corporate setting. Over the past 25 years, we've used precisely these same principles and skills to produce change like that you see Mike Miller achieved here. 93% reduction in defects, profound improvements in productivity, $20 million in cost saves, solely by influencing the behavior of 1,400 IT professionals at Sprint. And here's the thing I want you to know about Mike Miller. This remarkable culture change happened over a period of 4 months. The reason you need to know that is because people in my field have been doing people like you an enormous disservice for the past 30 years. We've been telling leaders like you that changing the culture of an organization frequently takes 10 years, 20 years. Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to tell you after the travel and the research that we've done is that that's the kind of argument you make when you're incompetent. If you don't know how to do it, you just ask for more time and more budget. When you know how to do it, you're able to produce change in fairly short order. So that's what we're going to discuss today. How do people like this think about influence? So if you want to take your little note cards out, here's a model. We found that there are 3 principles that explain the success of every one of these effective influencers. I'm going to cover 2 of them for you, one of them just very lightly here. The first is this. The first principle is what we call the principle of vital behaviors. Your first challenge when attempting to influence change is to identify what we call vital behaviors. Here's what we know. 2 big insights. The first thing is, the best way to improve results frequently is not to focus on results. It's to focus on behaviors, the behaviors that affect those results. So many of you, when you're starting to take apart the guinea worm problem, start in by saying, well, could we dig wells? Could we change the water supply? Could we do this or that? What we don't do is stop and say, what are the behaviors in the village that are creating the problem to begin with? That's your first task. The second important point that I want you to get from this finding is that even with very complicated and very long-standing problems, frequently just a few behaviors can lead to profound changes in results. So that's your goal. So let me get you back with your partner real quick. I'm going to give you 60 seconds on this. If you had to identify just a couple of behaviors you'd change in a village, what would they be to eradicate the guinea worm? What would just a couple of behaviors be if you were Don Hopkins? 60 seconds. Go for it. All right, let me pause you in the process there. So holler one out. Who's got one? Raise your hand if you have a thought. What's one behavior you'd work on? Yeah. Excellent, good. So this one's fairly clear. When somebody's infected and a guinea worm is starting to do its thing, right? If we could get them to stop going where? To the water supply. That would be a very vital behavior because that cuts off the opportunity, right, of the worm to perpetuate itself. What's one more? Raise your hand if you have another thought. Yeah.
Boil the water before they use it.
Good, good. He says boil the water before they use it. Now, one thing you have to know about these villages is often they don't have a lot of firewood, and so boiling might not be the strategy, but the principle here is what? Try to clean the water somehow, right? Whatever is the best way for us to do this. So here's what Don Hopkins found. They went into the villages and they said, what are the behaviors that happen in villages that don't have guinea worm? And they found that there were 3. Now, what I want you to notice is, as Don Hopkins starts this influence process, what he doesn't do is what you and I typically do. What you and I typically do when we begin to try to influence change is we start by just setting vague goals, right? Set some high-level goal like, let's get rid of the infections in our village, and then we sort of just walk away from it. We'll often just transmit these goals through an organization, but without any real thought to what are the behaviors we need to change. Second, we'll often advocate vague values. You know, let's have teamwork here. Let's do that. Let's have trust, integrity, and communication in our organization. It turns out if that's your influence strategy, that it doesn't lead to much change. And finally, we'll sort of lead out with strategies. Let's issue pamphlets. Let's put signs up in the village. Let's hand out filter cloths or whatever it is. And what we know is the first step is to identify vital behaviors. They found 3. Filter water. Don't put your infected limb in water. And number 1, hold other people accountable to filter their water and not put their infected limbs in water. Now, does this work in organizations? We know that leaders in organizations struggle with their equivalent of the guinea worm. We can't launch projects on time. Things go over budget. We have all sorts of issues that persist year after year after year. My question to you is, what kinds of behaviors happen in your organization that keep these problems happening? What I want you to do is just take 60 seconds and ask yourself the question, what are some of the behaviors that happen in your organization that cause projects to not hit their budget, not hit their schedule, not get the quality that they need? What are some of the common behaviors that you see and witness? 60 seconds. Just brainstorm from your experience. All right. So this is how the process works. You start by saying if we have chronic problems delivering results on time and on budget, what are some of the common behaviors that create the problems? Now, we did a worldwide study asking this question and found there are 3 kinds of behaviors that happen regularly. Let me see if they happen in your organization as well that set you up for failure in a project. The first we call fact-free planning. You ever seen that one? So we get together at the beginning of the project and set a budget and a deadline with no consideration for reality. You ever seen that happen? Yeah, sets us up for failure. Second, AWOL sponsors, executive sponsors don't show up for meetings, don't do what they're supposed to, don't follow up. You ever seen that happen? These set you up for failure. And finally, Project Chicken. This is where bad news gets suppressed. Everybody knows it isn't working, but nobody says a word. These behaviors happen, and we know that the project will fail. So task 1 is to identify these vital behaviors. What are the few behaviors that create the most amount of problems? If I'm trying to get off drugs, if I'm trying to quit smoking, if I'm trying to lose weight, frequently there are just a few behaviors at a few times of the day or a few times of the week that create most of the problems I've got. That's your first task. Your second task, if you take a look at the model, moving to the left, is to create an influence strategy to help people change these behaviors. How do we do that? Well, let me start off with a little test for us. This is really, really important. So if you take out a piece of paper, I'm going to ask you to write down the first 3 things that come into your head when I describe this influence problem. So, we know that in hospitals across the United States that tens of thousands of people will get infected this year by healthcare workers who fail to do what? Wash their hands. That's a vital behavior. We know that's one very vital behavior that would make a big difference if we could get everybody doing it. You know what the compliance rate is in the average American hospital for hand washing? Anybody guess? Yeah. Yeah, it would be nice if it were in the 70s or 80s. The compliance rate in many hospitals is in the 30% range. Isn't this awful? Now, I'm not trying to throw rocks at our hospitals because we all have the same issues. They just create bigger problems and more immediate problems in hospitals and other places. But think about this for a minute. The next time you're laying in a hospital bed and a healthcare worker approaches you with outstretched hands, what should you assume? Yeah? What should you say? Yeah. In fact, I'm going to do it for you, right? Escort them over to the sink. So, we know that the compliance rate is fairly low. I was at one of the finest teaching hospitals in the United States about a year and a half ago, talking to the vice president of quality. And she said, we struggle with this in our hospital. I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. It's a wonderful institution. She said, in fact, you know who the worst offender is here? I said, who? She said, the worst offender is our chief of staff. She said, our chief of staff will go on grand rounds every day with all sorts of residents following after him, and he will never wash his hands. He'll go from patient to patient to patient, touching this chart and that patient, coughing into his hand, and then going to the next one and never wash his hands. On your piece of paper, I'd like you to write down the first 3 answers that come into your mind to the question of why. Why is this guy not washing his hands? Write them down. 3 answers. Why would he not be washing his hands? All right. Okay, now I want you to hang on to that list because here's what I'm going to tell you about your list. The quality of that list determines the level of your influence. What you just did is something you and I almost never do before we start trying to influence change. What we almost never do is stop and ask the question, why are people doing what they're doing today? We know what we want to get them to do. We start trying to kick them in the pants to get them to do it, but we never stop and ask the question, why are they doing what they're doing today? Your capacity to answer that question predicts the level of your influence. The degree to which we are capable of answering that in a thorough and effective way is the degree to which we can create influence strategies that truly work. How many of you on your list at least somewhere had that he's doing it because he's an arrogant, rule-breaking SOB? How many of you had that? Somewhere on your list, yeah. Most of us do. How many of you had some version of because he's lazy or doesn't care? How many of you had a little bit of that? And now here's what we do. So what we tend to do when we're trying to understand people's behavior is we jump right to they don't care. They're not motivated. It's the kind of person they are. Why can't I stick with my diet? Because I just don't have the gumption, the self-discipline, right? That's the problem. It's in me somewhere. Now, that could be part of the problem. It could. Could very well be part of it. But here's what you're at risk for if that's what you focus on. You and I tend to live in a world that wants those kinds of quick, easy answers. It's just lazy people. It's just people that don't care. We want silver bullets. We want some magic answer. Just train everybody and then they'll change, right? Just change your incentive plan and then everybody's behavior will change in the organization. If this is the way we create our influence strategies, we fail. This is why our failure rates are so high. So let me give you a challenge. I would argue that unless and until you know how the following statement is true, you'll fail at influencing change. Unless and until you have a thorough and effective answer to that statement, you will never succeed at change. Unless and until you know how the world is perfectly organized to keep me from losing weight, to keep me from quitting smoking, to keep people from washing their hands the way they should. Unless and until you know how you've designed unwittingly, usually, unintentionally usually, a world that is fighting against the behavior you'd like to have, you will be ineffective at creating change. Here's what we know. we know that there are 6 different sources of influence that you've got to pull together to help people change persistent and resistant behavior. So keep that list going. And as we go through these, what I want you to do is see how many we're missing on your list, how many more we could learn about that would expand our influence repertoire. Here's the basic principle. The principle is that there is not one cause for most persistent behavior. There's a conspiracy, and as we all know, best way to fight a conspiracy is with a foil hat, right? Or perhaps with a better influence strategy, a broader repertoire. If you want to influence persistent behavior, you're going to have to draw on many sources of influence simultaneously. Here's the promise. Influencers succeed where the rest of us fail because they do that. Influencers succeed where the rest of us fail because they over-determine success. They marshal 4 or more of these sources of influence simultaneously to overwhelm the bad behavior and help it to change. That's what you've got to learn to do. So let's talk about them real quick. Here's the first. How many of you have ever stood in front of a refrigerator door wishing you had the will to not eat something you're staring at? Have you ever had that happen before? How many of you have ever brought home a half a piece of chocolate cake from the restaurant the night before, put it into the refrigerator, and thought about it all day long? Have you ever done that? I mean, you know you're a certified chocoholic when you're conscious of it and you're texting your kids to make sure they don't eat it before you get home that day. That's the definition of a chocoholic. You're standing in front of the refrigerator door knowing you shouldn't. And the problem you're up against is the influence of the pain or pleasure of the behavior itself. Eating chocolate is pleasurable. That's why I do it. Not eating chocolate is painful. That's why I don't do that, right? Not putting my leg in the water when a guinea worm is coming out is painful. And that's why I don't want to do that. Washing my hands 100 times a day is annoying, distracting, boring. So the problem you're up against as an influencer that we all know is many positive behaviors, many vital behaviors are boring, frightening, uncomfortable, sometimes even painful. The flip side of that is many bad behaviors feel kind of good. So if on your list somewhere you had that one, doesn't want to wash his hands because it's just too much trouble and he's lazy and all that, check the box, you got it. But let's move on.